Stock futures fall and havens surge as President Trump threatens new tariffs on European allies in his pursuit of a Greenland takeover.
And I may do that for Greenland too. I may put a tariff on countries if they don't go along with Greenland, because we need Greenland for national security. So I may do that. I'll give you a little.
Starting February 1st, the president says that tariff will continue until a deal is reached,
as he slaps new tariffs on 8 countries until the U.S. is able to buy that island.
After European countries denounced Trump's aggressive stance on acquiring Greenland, now the president.
What if a single tariff threat could shake alliances that took decades to build? The United States' latest message to Europe has left leaders in London and Brussels stunned and angry. This move has raised fears of trade pain, broken trust, and pressure politics replacing fair talks.
Nor is it helpful to frame efforts to strengthen Greenland's security as a justification for economic pressure.
European voices are now speaking more openly about pushing back and protecting their own interests. Greenland has been pulled into the spotlight as a strategic prize with big consequences. But the people of Greenland and their partners say decisions about their future cannot be forced. Can the United States really use trade pressure against allies without paying a price? Will this moment mark a turning point for Europe's independence in global affairs?
20 minutes past the hour now, and some of America's closest European allies pushing back on President Trump's pursuit of Greenland.
Keep watching as we uncover the full story behind the fury, the facts, and the power struggle. On a freezing morning in January 2026, one statement from Washington caused instant alarm in London, Brussels, and Copenhagen. The President of the United States revealed a plan to place new tariffs on several European countries and Norway. The announcement directly tied these measures to Greenland and to decisions about the island's future. The proposal was harsh by normal standards. A 10% tariff scheduled to begin on February 1st, climbing to 25% on June 1st if the island's political direction did not shift in ways the United States approved of. Denmark and its territory Greenland were named, along with several NATO and EU members that had supported defence actions and military deployments in the Arctic. This was not empty talk. The White House presented the tariffs as a matter of national security and economic pressure, describing them as a direct method to force compliance. Within hours, senior officials in London condemned the move and warned that relations could fracture if Washington followed through. The reaction in the United Kingdom went beyond frustration. It was fury. What began as strange comments about Greenland quickly escalated into a serious transatlantic crisis, with real economic damage and real geopolitical danger. The first political responses in the United Kingdom made 2 points clear. The tariff threat was viewed not only as a trade dispute, but as an assault on the basic standards that bind allies together. Prime Minister Keir Starmer and top ministers said that using tariffs against close partners to influence territorial outcomes crossed a serious line. Starmer called the approach completely wrong. He urged restraint while making it clear that the UK would not submit to pressure over issues that belong to Denmark and Greenland alone. At the same time, the announcement pushed European leaders to consider a wide range of responses. Some favoured careful diplomacy. Others began discussing legal and economic countersteps. EU officials talked openly about using tools that allow collective responses to economic pressure. That was a sign that the conflict could move fast from words to action if Washington turned threats into policy. These talks were not symbolic. They reflected real fear that the situation could spiral and cause lasting harm to trade and trust across the Atlantic. Markets reacted quickly. Investors moved towards safer assets. The dollar weakened as concern grew about a trade clash between the world's largest economy and its closest partners. Analysts warned that if the tariffs were introduced and later expanded, several European economies could suffer slower growth. This risk was concrete. Manufacturing industries, car exports, agricultural trade, and cross-border supply chains that link US and European production would all become more expensive to operate. Businesses and ordinary consumers would carry much of that burden. The policy pointed towards short-term financial damage and long-term political consequences. Trade experts stress that using tariffs as a political threat runs against decades of work to base global trade on rules instead of power. The initial shock of the announcement was only the beginning. Behind the immediate controversy sits a deeper question about international law and the standards that have shaped global politics since World War II. The concern raised by the UK and many EU capitals was not limited to money or public reaction. It focused on whether a powerful country should be allowed to use trade pressure to force its allies into political concessions. Leaders in London and Brussels described the US action as a form of coercion that modern global systems were designed to block. Organisations like NATO, the World Trade Organization, and EU trade and legal structures were created to manage conflict through process, not through punishment. For many Europeans, the real issue is whether these systems still work when they are tested by a dominant power using economic force to gain strategic advantage. The message from many observers was direct. Alliances weaken when partners fear that trade will be used as a weapon rather than as a shared benefit. These fears did not appear out of thin air. In recent years, critics across Europe, and more voices inside the UK, have pointed to what they see as a pattern in US behaviour. They argue that Washington has leaned more toward pressure tactics and unilateral action, often in ways that clash with international law or widely accepted norms. They list examples: extensive use of sanctions, diplomatic campaigns aimed at regime change or recognition disputes, military actions with contested legality, selective acceptance of international court decisions, and unconditional political backing for allies accused of serious violations. For many in London, the Greenland Tariff threat became a turning point. The reasoning was simple. If the United States was prepared to threaten economic punishment to gain influence over territory, then it was prepared to step outside the rules that govern state behaviour. For European critics who have long been cautious about unchecked American power, this episode did not look like an isolated incident. It looked like part of a broader direction. To support this view, critics pointed to US actions in places such as Venezuela, Gaza, and military operations in countries like Syria. Venezuela is often cited first. For years, Washington has led efforts to pressure the government of Nicolas Maduro, using strong economic sanctions and political recognition tactics to weaken his control. In early 2019, the United States recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president and followed that step with sanctions targeting oil exports, financial systems, and individual officials. These policies were meant to cut funding to Maduro's government and raise pressure for political change. Supporters claimed this approach defended democracy and punished corruption without violence. Critics, including many in Europe, argued that broad sanctions deepened suffering for ordinary people and raised serious questions about sovereignty and interference. The policy has continued with adjustments over time, sometimes tightening restrictions, sometimes offering limited relief in exchange for political concessions. To many observers in London, this looked less like coordinated global action and more like a one-sided campaign to shape another country's political future. More recent events connected to Venezuela deepened the feeling in Europe that Washington was acting on its own. In late 2025 and early 2026, the US government began seizing ships it claimed were part of a shadow fleet transporting sanctioned oil linked to Venezuela. It also announced broader actions against companies tied to that industry. These seizures and legal steps quickly became controversial and were challenged in court, raising serious questions about jurisdiction, maritime law, and whether the United States should be acting as a global enforcer of trade rules. Around the same time, reports surfaced about a US operation in Caracas that reportedly ended with the arrest of a sitting Venezuelan president. Whether such actions were lawful or justified remains heavily disputed. For foreign ministries across Europe, the idea of a major power detaining a foreign head of state, even when presented as a law enforcement matter, brings back memories of earlier interventions that clashed with basic ideas of national sovereignty. These issues are not minor details in diplomacy. They shape how European voters and political leaders view American conduct and how ready they are to accept claims that the United States should operate by different rules. Gaza presents another point of conflict. In the UN Security Council and in diplomatic forums, the United States has repeatedly taken a position of strong political support for Israel. In many key votes, it has used its veto to block resolutions that aim to stop military operations or impose sanctions. During recent rounds of violence, the US delegation has cast vetoes, or signalled that it would, against measures calling for ceasefires or wider humanitarian access. These decisions have angered many European partners. They argue that by blocking collective action, Washington weakens the authority of the Security Council and leaves civilians to suffer. Critics in the UK often say that standing fully behind Israel and using diplomatic power to protect it from international criticism looks like a deliberate political choice that places loyalty above fairness and legal consistency. Across Europe, many people see this as proof that the United States will protect its allies even when humanitarian concerns point in another direction. A third area driving European criticism involves military strikes and interventions where the legal justification is disputed. The United States has carried out airstrikes and other uses of force in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East, often citing self-defense, counter-terrorism, or the protection of civilians. Legal experts have argued for years over how far these justifications can go under international law. These disagreements are not abstract. They affect alliances in real ways. When Washington acts without clear authorization from the UN Security Council or without broad multilateral backing, partner countries must decide whether they can publicly support such moves. Often they choose not to. The result is tension in diplomatic relationships and less room for joint security efforts. Many Europeans who believe strongly in collective decision-making see these actions as proof that the United States sometimes places its own security judgments and legal interpretations above shared agreement. That pattern helps explain the sharp reaction to the Greenland Tariff threat. If Washington is willing to use both trade and force to get its way, then some ask what shared institutions are really worth. It matters to be clear about what these critics are actually saying. Most are not arguing that every US action is illegal or driven by bad intent. The United States has internal debate, legal limits, and democratic checks. The argument coming from many voices in the UK and across Europe is more focused. They believe that in many cases, American leaders have shown a willingness to rely on unilateral tools instead of collective ones. That approach can sometimes deliver quick results, but it also carries costs. It can push allies away, reduce intelligence sharing, weaken cooperation, and make joint responses to shared threats harder to organise. The Greenland Tariff threat brought these fears into sharp focus because it suggested that economic pressure could be used not against rivals, but against partners to achieve strategic goals. European concern was not just about money, it was about confidence. If an ally is prepared to use tariffs against friends, then future cooperation on issues such as defence procurement or intelligence sharing becomes more fragile. That is why European institutions moved quickly to discuss joint responses. Officials in Brussels and national capitals examined the EU's anti-coercion instrument, a legal mechanism designed to let the bloc respond when another country uses economic pressure. This tool had been discussed for years and was previously shelved during earlier tariff disputes. Faced with a serious threat from the United States, EU leaders returned to the idea. Their reasoning was straightforward. If a powerful partner uses economic threats, then defenders of rule-based trade must have a credible way to respond, or deterrence loses its effect. These legal and diplomatic discussions reflect a Europe that is more ready to use its own tools to defend its interests and protect the system of rules it depends on. For leaders in the UK, who have long placed great weight on NATO and ties with Washington, this created a difficult choice. Still, many concluded that giving in to pressure would carry greater long-term damage. Claims that the United States applies double standards are not new. They date back to debates over American foreign policy in the years following the Cold War. What feels different now is the perception that Washington has adopted a more transactional approach and is less anchored in shared institutions. Whether this reflects a lasting strategic shift or simply the style of a particular administration is open to debate. For audiences in the UK, the more urgent issue is practical. Could American pressure be used to force strategic concessions that change the balance of power in places like the Arctic, energy markets, or other contested regions? The Greenland episode suggested that these concerns are no longer theoretical. If Washington views Greenland as a direct national interest and is willing to pressure allies to secure it, then European governments must question whether long-standing rules and alliances can still be relied on when interests begin to clash. Public reaction across the United Kingdom was intense. News coverage framed the White House decision as both a diplomatic slight and an economic challenge. Opinion writers argued that Europe should not accept pressure, while commentators urged a calm but firm reply. Opposition figures used the moment to attack the government for any sign of weakness. At the same time, voices supporting a tougher line toward the United States said countermeasures should be considered. Surveys showed that in certain groups, most respondents viewed the tariff threat as unjustified interference in European affairs. That public mood carries real political weight. In democratic systems, foreign policy is shaped not just by legal theory, but by how voters feel and whether leaders can defend costly decisions at home. When people believe an ally has acted dishonestly, support for resistance and cooperation with other partners tends to grow. This conflict also highlights broader changes in global power dynamics. The Arctic is turning into an area of competition as melting ice opens new shipping routes and access to resources. Greenland's geographic position and mineral wealth give it strategic importance that goes beyond its small population or economy. That makes it difficult to treat the territory as only a local concern. Outside powers will pay attention. The real issue is how that attention is handled. European leaders argue that the correct approach involves joint consultation, respect for local authority, and coordinated security through NATO and similar frameworks. From the US perspective, acting alone can appear quicker and more reliable, especially when there is little trust in multilateral systems. The debate over Greenland tariffs exposed a deeper conflict, whether global rivalry should be managed through shared rules or through raw pressure. European governments argue that rules exist specifically to prevent the kind of pressure now being used. Criticism of US behaviour also fits into a wider concern about the weakening of the post-war international order. For decades, trade and security systems were built on the idea that powerful states would limit themselves through shared rules. Institutions such as the WTO, NATO, and the UN were created to guide competition into predictable channels instead of force. When a superpower challenges those standards, through tariffs aimed at allies, through sanctions applied beyond its borders, or through military action justified by one-sided legal claims, those systems come under strain. Europe's growing awareness of the risk posed by one-sided pressure is a direct result of that strain. Leaders in London and Brussels now speak more openly about backup strategies, legal responses, and deeper cooperation within Europe. This is not hostility toward the United States. It is an attempt to defend a community of 450 million people against economic pressure that can be applied within minutes. Supporters of the tariff language in Washington argue that economic pressure is a valid tool in foreign policy. They claim that when diplomacy fails, other methods must be used to protect national security and key interests. They point to rising competitors and the need to secure access to strategic regions. They also argue that alliances come with expectations and that partners must take US security concerns seriously. These arguments resonate with some audiences, but they lose force when aimed at allies over disputed territories whose sovereignty rests on history, law, and the views of local people. The issue then becomes not whether pressure can be used, but when it should be used. For the UK and many across Europe, that boundary had been crossed. Using tariffs to force concessions over Greenland looked less like sensible policy and more like economic pressure. The possible effects are serious in both the short and long term. In the near future, tariffs would harm exporters, farmers, car manufacturers, and small firms that depend on trade between Europe and North America. Businesses in Britain and across the continent would face difficult choices: absorb higher costs, pass them on to customers, or restructure supply chains, all of which carry heavy costs. A prolonged trade conflict could cut investment and slow economic growth. Over time, the deeper harm would be political. Trust fades slowly, but once broken, it is difficult to rebuild. Allies who fear pressure from a partner will take precautions. They will strengthen regional ties, diversify security links, and develop legal tools to reduce vulnerability. These steps may be practical, but they also weaken the sense that alliances are built on loyalty rather than rivalry. For the United Kingdom, which has long depended on its relationship with the United States, that reality is difficult to accept. The debate also brings up difficult questions about the role of the United States on the global stage. European critics have argued for years that the US moves back and forth between defending international rules and behaving as though those rules do not apply to it. Supporters of US policy respond by saying the country plays a central role in maintaining a global system that has helped many nations. They argue that American power and readiness to act discourage aggression and help keep global institutions stable. The situation around Greenland forced a serious moment of reflection. If allies cannot predict when economic pressure will be used as a negotiating tactic, the foundation of interdependence begins to weaken. Europe's reaction was therefore not limited to criticism. It also involved strengthening its own protective measures across legal, economic, and diplomatic areas. This shift reflects a clear understanding that trust alone is not a plan in a world where pressure can be applied quickly and with real impact. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like so more people can see it. Share your thoughts in the comments because your opinion matters here. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into global politics and real-world power moves. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.